Hi, everybody. We're going to spend the next week or so in this class with Essential New Learning, dealing with what we decided was kind of the most important crux of what you needed to know and what we needed to do in order to cover a wide range of like European and Latin American history. And that is really looking at the Cold War in Latin America from about the 70s and 80s, okay, kind of the late Cold War. And to do this, we'll look at two things. The first is Operation Condor, which we've talked about. You guys listened to a thing about, a discussion about, and read about the other day. And the second is the Dirty War, which occurred all over the continent. And Dirty War is essentially an undeclared war on the citizens of a population. So what it involves is like the government of a population taking people off the streets, rounding them up, disappearing them, as it's quote unquote called. And then basically doing that as a way of kind of combating and fighting its own citizens, or citizens it includes to be or considers to be undesirables, right? And in looking at this, we're really going to spend the bulk of our time in this class looking at what happened in Argentina, because what happened in Argentina is um, uh, not only massively problematic, but also a kind of like larger microcosm of the rest of the continent. And what happened in Argentina is also a massive exaggeration and deals with essentially a genocide. I mean, whether or not you classify it under the UN terms of genocide or not, there was a systematic attempt to erase anybody with any left-leaning tendencies in Argentina from 1976 to 1983 or so. Um, and so we're going to spend the bulk of our time looking at the goings on there. To give you an idea further on that, the other reason that we'll kind of look at Argentina is, all these countries and the big ones that were involved in Operation Condor are Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Bolivia. And all those countries are going to get tons of money from the United States in order to, quote unquote, combat communism. And Argentina is going to be by far the one that takes it to the most extreme. In about 20 years, there are about 150 people in Brazil that disappear during Brazil's Dirty War. And from 76 to 83, there are about 30,000 people that disappear in the Argentine Dirty War. So what you're looking at as you look at this right now is a sign that says going down towards torture and death. That was just the English translation to this thing that's now a museum, which says the Escuela de Mecánica de la Armada, also known as the ESMA. Okay, and this was the place in which Argentines were taken off the streets, rounded up, tortured, and then eventually, quote, transferred or killed. It's become known as the Argentine Auschwitz. And in order to understand this, and what this is basically going to be talking to you about for the next 30 minutes or so, is how Argentina got to the place it got to in the Dirty War. And what this really is a trip through Spanish oppression, the Catholic Church, a country's quasi-love affair with the military, a superiority complex, the quote-unquote need to save Western civilization, and finally the mess that is Juan D. Perón and Peronism. This story starts in Buenos Aires. And to be honest, Buenos Aires is an absolutely mind-blowingly, amazingly cool city. I'm going to take a minute or so to just show you pictures and stuff here. If you looked at me and said, Doran, you can be magically whisked off to anywhere you want in the world right now, it would really depend on my mood. There would be some days that I would choose Sydney, Australia, and there would be other days that I would choose Buenos Aires. Like, that's how awesome of a city it is. I found the food to be fascinating and interesting. Oh, God, Argentinian beef is as good as advertised, the best steak in the world. I found the culture and people also to be very friendly, very nice. Now, it might have been that we were dead in the middle of the World Cup when we were there in 2018 most recently. It's got a very like kind of European feel, and it also has like it's a huge city. I mean, it's this massive metropolis. It's actually the fourth biggest city in the Americas, behind only New York, Mexico City, and Sao Paulo. I mean, like it is an absolutely massively large city with tons of different offerings. I mean, everything from like people tangoing on the streets that you can see on the left to like old theaters that have been turned into like one of the world's coolest bookstores, which you can see up top. Here are some more pictures of Buenos Aires that I also wanted you guys to see. Some of them you've seen before. If you've ever paid attention to anything on my website before, you've seen that thing down at the bottom. That is the Casa Rosa, also known as the Pink House. In the White House, we have the location of the President of the United States is in the White House in the United States. Argentina, instead, they don't have a White House, they have a Pink House. So that's where the President is. Up top, you can see some of the main boulevards in Buenos Aires. It's got that old school European, but also kind of modern, large feel. And then on the right, you can also see something called Recoleta Cemetery, which is basically where like every famous Argentine like ever has been buried. It's a great place to just kind of wander around on a like random Thursday afternoon and just kind of see what you see. A very, very overarchingly chill city. I wish I had more time to talk to you about it and answer questions in class, but unfortunately we're on a time constraint and we got to kind of move on here. Okay, one thing of a lot of importance before we talk anything about the Dirty War, so that you understand what's going on, is the Dirty War is a massive tragedy. It is a tragedy on every sense of the world, but it is most famous for the following. During the Argentine Dirty War, pregnant women who disagreed with the Argentine government were abducted, they were imprisoned until they gave birth, they were murdered, and then their newborn families were given to quote unquote worthy Argentines, usually with close ties to the Navy. If anybody knows the story or has read The Handmaid's Tale, and if you haven't, you will when you get to 12th grade, that is precisely where the idea of like basically stealing babies and giving them to other people goes from. This is massively traumatic for a country and like really, really, really hard to kind of officially heal from, and that's what we'll get to in the end. But there was literally an official list, and of about the 400 children that were abducted, about 25% of them's true identity have been discovered. So you've got a roughly 300 people, and I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but if you think about the tragedy, it really is. In Buenos Aires, who are not these parents of the or not the kids of the parents they were given to, and their real parents were forced to give birth and then murdered, and then they were given to quote unquote worthy Argentines. So that's the real tragedy of the Dirty War here. Okay, were we in class right now, I would look at you guys and I would say, talk in your table groups about what you remember about Argentine history. But since you're not in table groups, I guess if you want to, you're welcome to hold a conversation with whatever pet you have nearby or anything along those lines. Just to jog your memory a little bit here. Remember, we've got um, allegiance to Spain. You've got revolutions. You've got Caudillos, and then Juan Manuel de Rosas, if you remember him, and like the rise of Caudillos. Then after this, we talked about Sarmiento. We talked about the ideas of progress, and like Argentina kind of being a leader in Latin America at that point. And we talked about how like they were slaves to European culture and society. Buenos Aires is still today more European than even London. Stuff along those lines. We talked about Julio de Roca, and we talked about the indigenous oppression in Latin America. We talked about the Triple Alliance War, neocolonialism, etc., etc. Southeast migration, and to be honest, the thing that's not on here that we've also talked about, because I talked about it at the end of Latin America in World War II, is the rat lines and the ties to Italy and the ties to Germany and the ties to Nazism, etc., etc. All these things are really important because it is going to lead to a massive superiority complex on the part of Argentina. Okay, basically, Argentina generally believes that it is the most important, it is the strongest, and it is the quote unquote best country in Latin America and therefore should take a role. It, to be honest, is not that dissimilar to the United States' general idea of itself, okay? What we'd call Argentine exceptionalism. And it's not unwarranted. When Argentina actually gets itself together, it is one of the richest countries in the world. It is one of the highest natural resources. I mean, when World War II started, Argentina was the 8th richest country in the world, significantly wealthier than places like Italy and stuff like that at the time. So, like, the whole thing is really kind of a, like, situation that builds up, and I know I've talked about this for a while, that leads to this massive superiority complex and this idea that, like, Argentina is special and therefore needs to save Western civilization. And if you don't understand that part of this, you can't possibly understand what's going through people's head during the Dirty War. Aside from understanding the idea of an Argentinian superiority complex, we also have to go back about 60, 70 years to fully understand what happened with the Dirty War. And it begins with a dude by the name of Hipólito Yrigoyen. Um, and if you can think of it this way, D.F. Sarmiento, if you remember him and you read about him, and we talked about this idea of progress and basically everything in the future was good and everything in the past was bad and blah, blah, blah. He and his group of people had been in power for a generation. And at this point, while they were super liberal to start, by the time 1960 rolls around, being in power since 1880, they're fairly conservative. As a matter of fact, like, progress has left a lot of people behind. The people that, like, bought into Sarmiento's ideas were there, but the natives, for example, got, like, completely obliterated in the name of progress progress. Okay, we're going to move these people on, etc., etc. Okay, so Jürgen wins the presidency, right? Um, he basically, I mean, you don't really need to know back and forth. Like he wins and he loses to another liberal and he wins. But the overarching point is this: is that Argentina enters the late 19 teens, early 1920s with these massive amounts of reforms going on. Okay, and this is when a very kind of uniquely Argentine, but also bothersome tradition occurs, which is that throughout the course of the 20th century, when the people in power in Argentina do not like the progressive liberalism that the people who have been voted into office have put forward and now want to do, they start a military coup. Okay, this is going to be the first of 6 military coups in Argentina in the 20th century. And the whole Dirty War is going to be catalyzed by a military coup that's kind of subtly backed by the United States. Okay, this one is led by a general by the name of Iraburu. He seizes La Casa Rosa, the pink house. Suspends parliament, gets support of a group of people known as the Nacionalistas, okay? And this is going to be really important because they're Nationalistas in the Argentine Patriots League in the 1920s or so are going to basically be the Argentinian answer to what's going on in Europe in the 1920s with the nationalism and the rise of Mussolini and the rise of then Hitler and stuff like that. This is why I talked to you guys in that lecture about the Tango Wars, about kind of the close connection between Latin America and Europe at that time. Okay, so Uruburu gets rid of everything. Uruguayan has to go into exile, etc., etc. And Argentina essentially becomes a fascist dictatorship in the 1920s and 1930s. The problem is, though, and this is always going to be the issue within Argentine politics, is that not only is it a fascist dictatorship, but it's a fascist dictatorship that's quasi-sanctioned by the church. They knew about it ahead of time. They were in favor of this. They thought that Uruguayan's reforms were like problematic and that the country needed to be more conservative, etc., etc. And the end result is that at first Uruburu works well. He creates this kind of corporatist style like autarky where Argentina like has tons of natural resources and the economy goes really well. But by the end of it, the 1930s, when the rest of the economy is starting to go downhill in the world, Argentina starts to tank. Import substitution industrialization, or ISI, has pretty much like died out in its usefulness, and so like the Argentinian like economy goes downhill. This becomes known as the infamous decade because like it's the beginning of a number of military coups that will be problematic in this country. Right there is a picture of the Pink House, just so you can see this is going to be where the Argentine president lives. It's important to note because it's right there in the center of Buenos Aires, but it also is a place for rallying on a number of different occasions. There are protests outside it, which I'll show you pictures of later as we're studying this, but also during Uraburu's time, but also when this other president, this dude by the name of Juan Perón, comes into power, there are literally going to be attacks and bombings on the Pink House and stuff like that. So as you can imagine, this would be equivalent of a bunch of people outside the White House, and then a plane comes over and bombs them and stuff like that. And that hasn't happened yet, but it's something that is actively going to happen in the 1940s and 1950s in Argentina, and gives you an idea of kind of the like political instability that's occurring in the country at that time. The infamous decade in Argentina results in a slew of conservative presidents after Uriburu, like heading into like the late 30s and early 40s. Who don't answer the people, who are involved in rigged elections, etc., etc. They wanted to go to like full-fed fascism, but they really don't have the key support of the people. They can only be like so far because there still is enough of a populist movement in Argentina, with people feeling like the government's not looking to them, that hardcore fascism doesn't have the backing that it does in places like Italy and Germany at this time. But the one thing that does come into this is it does allow, and this is going to be key, Uriburu and other people to target foreigners, to target Jews, and yes, even when we get back to the Dirty Wars in the 70s and 80s, it's still going to be a targeting of Jews, just like under like the Nazis and stuff like that, in an effort to get rid of like Argentina's quote-unquote problems, right? And they're able to play up to that, which plays to the nationalistas and fear-mongering, etc., etc. And then when like Argentina's economy goes in decline, then Otabor is even able to say, and this should be kind of familiar to stuff that's being said today. Oh well, this is because there are problems and there are not enough people in Argentina who support Argentina itself, and what we really need to do is get rid of some of the foreigners and make Argentina great again and stuff along those lines. And he handpicks a very unpopular successor. And the problem like this, and this should be really, really key and should make a lot of sense after reading Václav Havel's The Power of the Powerless, is remember in that Havel argues that if you take power via force, then you're going to rule via force, and then eventually you're going to lose power via force. And that's exactly what happens to Otabor. He takes power via force, he rules via force, and then he's originally deposed in a coup led by a man by the name of Arturo Rossin. Okay. The problem is that Rossin's not really that popular, but he's got a really popular colonel. Okay, a man by the name of Juan de Perón. Okay, and Perón is going to be the seminal figure in Argentinian politics for the next like 3 decades or so. Perón emerges as a populist man of the people, okay? And Perón's really good at this. If anything, Perón is politically promiscuous. It's absolutely amazing. He loves everybody, hates everybody. I mean, one day Perón can be a communist, the next day he can be a Nazi. Whatever it takes in order to, like, get the people to like him, Perón will go with whatever. He has no, like, hardcore like political ideology that he really needs to be into, etc., etc. He actually gets so popular that they end up having to imprison him to try to stop his popularity. That has the opposite effect, and instead Perón is thrown into prison, and people say, no, get him out of prison. We want him to be president. And Juan Perón takes power. He doesn't officially assume the presidency until 1946. He's got a very famous wife by the name of Eva Maria de Duarte de Perón, who's also known as Evita. And I'm sorry, I'm just butchering Spanish words like it's my job today. Either way, Evita, who ends up having a whole musical and stuff made after her and becomes kind of a person of legend, etc., etc., is a very famous, Argentine national figure today. She's on the equivalent of the $20 bill in Argentina, the like 10,000 peso thing or whatever it is. But anyway, the point is that Perón, in his nationalist popularity, etc., etc., takes power. And by 1945, when World War II ends, Argentina is the 8th richest nation in the world, which is something it absolutely should have been because it has more natural resources than almost any country in the entire world save the United States. It's insane the amount of availability of natural resources Argentina has. Right here are pictures of Juan Perón and Evita. You can see Perón in the center right there in like full Argentinian national president garb, etc., etc. You can see pictures of his wife on either side. That's her on a building over there, as well as her family, the Duarte. Crypt. That's the word I was looking for. But the other thing you can also see is this thing over here that's by Juan de Perón, and it says, how to be a model Argentinian. And it's literally just a book that I picked up at a market in the streets of Buenos Aires, but I thought it was interesting because it really puts forward this idea of how to be a model Argentinian and how to be a nationalist Argentinian that Perón is really putting forward in order to like get people supporting Argentina and behind him, which is going to lead to this idea of Argentinian exceptionalism that I discussed earlier that's really going to lead to the problem of the Dirty War. Okay, so now Perón and Evita, who is very much seen as like Eleanor Roosevelt, Jacqueline Kennedy, I mean one of these like married to the president but almost as famous as the president type of thing people, are now in power. And it's unique for a number of reasons. It's a military coup that occurs in the middle of a war, it's a conservative toppling another conservative, but most importantly, when Juan Perón comes to power, he tries really hard to say that he wants to have this rooted in democracy. It's almost it's an authoritarian form of democracy. I think the closest analogous thing that I can find to it in history is like Napoleonic style democracy, which is like, we want to have a democracy and we want to do that, but we really want you to also agree with us, etc., etc. So I wouldn't necessarily call it quote unquote real democracy, but regardless, that's the idea. And Perón is not a fascist. He is a authoritarian. He's a quasi-populist, quasi-democratic populist. Sometimes he dabbles in communism and stuff like that. What is more important, though, is that Perón definitely had sympathies towards the Catholic Church. He's very Catholic, and in Argentina, the Catholic Church really matters, okay? The Catholic Church has to sign off and say a lot of different things for things to work within Argentine politics, okay? And he also has sympathy towards, like, various Nazis as a result of the Catholic Church, because, like, if you remember from that, we talked about rat lines and stuff like that, and how the Italian Catholic Church really perpetuated help getting fascists out of Europe, and Catholic Church in Italy ties to Catholic Church in Argentina with a lot of Italian population, and so if Perón is famous for anything outside of Argentina, it's for allowing people like Josef Mengele, et cetera, to flee on rat lines to America, or to South America, sorry. However, what he did in Argentina is way more important internally within the country, if that makes sense. Yes, the rat lines are horrible and stuff along those lines, but like in order to like set up the problems inside the country, Perón also like went to that, right? And Perón had really kind of four things that you should be aware of that like led to the situation in Argentine politics. The first one is demagoguery. Okay, Perón would turn populist rallies into political trouble for fun. So, like for example, if Perón was in political trouble, and believe me, I'm talking about Juan Perón. I'm not talking about other people that may exist in this country now. I'm actually talking about Juan Perón. But if Perón was in political trouble, his solution would be to ignore the problem entirely and hold a massive rally in some random place in Argentina and be like, "Oh look, everybody loves me," right? He was politically expedient. He would support whomever, whenever, wherever, as we've talked about. Ideologically promiscuous is another way to say it, however you want. From Nazis to communists, as long as it helped him rule and govern, it didn't really matter. He promoted Argentine exceptionalism, the idea that Argentina has a unique place in the world and could return Western civilization to its core values. This is going to be the heart of the issue of the junta. Okay, like literally, if you can imagine this saying, okay, Argentina is the last, like, quote unquote Western, quote unquote Christian and Catholic nation left, so therefore we have to preserve it. And the final is what we call the cross and the sword, the idea, the intersection in Argentina of religion, politics, war, machismo, etc., etc. We saw that with like the Rosas and the caudillas and stuff along those lines. And what that does is that normalizes anti-Semitism, it normalizes machismo, it normalizes like masculinity, stuff along those lines. And while there are problems in all of this, the issue is this, is that Perón is really popular. He's giving a lot back to the people. He's raising taxes on the rich. He's lowering taxes on the poor. And everybody loves Evita. So he stays really, really popular in Argentina until the mid-1950s or so. However, by the time he wins a second presidency in 1952, okay, the ruling classes are starting to get really frustrated. And the ruling classes in Argentina means the church and the military. Okay, what this means is higher taxes on them. The church objected to his like cult of personality and his influence in like private life. For example, he took education out of the church's hands and put it into the state's hands, which is what anybody in any country in Western civilization, or Eastern for the most part, in any civilization, would probably consider to be good at this point. Like, hey, let's stop the religious education and let's move towards like secular education. But like at that time, that was seen as a big affront to the church, right? And the cult of personality scares people. People liked Juan Perón, they liked Evita, and so that really began to scare the military. On June 14th, the Catholic bishops began to speak out against Perón. By the 16th, Perón, in order to respond to the Catholic bishops, he holds a big rally at the Casa Rosada, the Pink House. And I didn't mention the place in the Casa Rosada, the Pink House, that like area right in front of it is known as the Plaza de Mayo, that area. That'll come up later because there are always in Argentina and Buenos Aires protests in the Plaza de Mayo. Okay, so keep that in mind. So he bombed, the military forces bombed the Casa Rosa and the Plaza de Mayo. They try to take out Perón. This fails, but 300 people die. That was that part earlier when I said, like, if you can imagine bombing the president's house, like, in the middle of a rally, that's what went on here. Peronists try to retaliate, and literally all hell breaks loose, okay? By September, the military government has overthrown Juan Perón. Perón ends up hiding on a gunboat on the Rio de la Plata, which is the kind of like area that separates kind of Argentina and Uruguay, and then eventually guaranteeing safe passage to Paraguay, where he goes into exile. At the height of this thing, like, literally, like, even humming the Peronist, like, because he had Peronist and Peronism and stuff like that, even humming the Peronist anthem could land you in jail after Juan Perón and his people have been overthrown and arrested by the Argentine establishment. Now, before we move on to the next one, you might notice it says Donde está Juan Perón up top, okay? Now, this is because if you've ever been in my office, you might have noticed a book that says that. When I was in Buenos Aires, I came across a book that said Donde está Juan de Perón, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And what it was, where is Juan Perón in the style of Where's Waldo? And it is absolutely mind-blowingly hysterical. I couldn't put it in the PowerPoint, so I uploaded it to the website. If you get a chance, take some time, open it up, try to find Juan Perón. Where is he these days? Who knows? It'll be fascinating, but give it a look. Donde está Juan Perón? Okay, now that you're hopefully back after spending some time on MrDoran.net and opening the PDF and finding Juan Perón all over the place, he's in space, he's on the beach, he's all over the place. Now we are taking a look at, again, the Casa Rosada, as well as the Plaza de Mayo, okay, which is the, main area of that, that's the kind of main plaza that makes up, governmental epicenter of Argentina. That's the word I was looking for. And it's also where the main protests occur even today within Buenos Aires. Later on, I'll show you pictures of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. Those are the people that protest every week on Thursday at 3:30. I went to one of the protests. I actually, as I said, not just pictures but video, that protest the fact that they can't find their missing grandchildren. In other words, their daughters and sons were disappeared. Their children were given to, or grandchildren were given to other people, and now they go and protest that on a weekly basis in this place. So that is the Casa Rosada and the Plaza de Mayo right there. The 1960s in Argentina are one of the worst decades ever. There is coup after coup. It actually starts to get ridiculous. My favorite point is when there's an internal coup and one person of the military overthrows another one during the course of this. And all of the 1960s is authoritarian rule, despite the fact that it's democratic. It's democratic in the same way that, the People's Republic of Korea or whatever is democratic, right? The end result is if you spend from 1950 the mid 50s, okay, 52 is when Perón's reelected, and then at that point people start speaking out of him. If you spin that through the early 1970s, with fascism and dictatorship, you're going to normalize violence, you're going to normalize problems, you're going to normalize brawls in the streets and stuff like that the SS and SA and stuff like that used to do. You're also going to normalize the idea of disappearances, okay? And this is something that is fairly foreign within, well, hopefully fairly foreign within the United States. And it is this idea that people just literally disappear, okay? So somebody's on the street and then a bunch of people pull up in a van or something like that, they grab them and they disappear. There's no trial, there's no understanding of them, etc., etc. This is actually what the Nazis did originally in the 1930s. They did it in the middle of the night. They called it Nebel und Nacht, night and fog, right? And people were told, okay, they've disappeared, they've been taken into protective custody, and protective custody became Dachau, and then they were never seen of again. And so that becomes fairly common. Now, as I said earlier, Brazil has way more training, way more help. 133 people disappear in in Brazil, and 30,000 in the end will disappear in Argentina. So that's why I'm building all this up about how we got to where we got in Argentina, because it's the normalization of this violence and stuff like that. It's the exceptionalism, it's the Catholic Church, all these things that make this okay. And the general consensus amongst historians is that Argentina's sociocultural history was uniquely aligned for this, okay? And that you had people, in the same way that the general consensus is that, Germany's sociocultural history was uniquely aligned for Nazism. And I am not comparing what happened during the Dirty War to what happened to the Nazis. The Nazis are a bazillion times worse. I'm just saying that the idea is a unique alignment amongst historians, right? What that is that first you had Rosas and the Caudillos, right, and stuff along those lines. They thrived in Argentina. They were violent bullies. That set up the nationalistas idea. That set up Argentinian exceptionalism. Argentinian exceptionalism was furthered by Sarmiento, who railed against the natives and the uneducated. He tried to get Argentina educated like crazy, but that led to problems, and that led to a number of different basically prejudices, right? That Julio Roca furthered even more by hunting out and getting rid of the vast majority of the natives. And so the end result is that by the time the 20th century rolls around, Argentina, with its ideas of machismo, its influence of the Catholic Church, its exceptionalist idea and the need to save Western civilization, all this plays in perfectly to a very, very violent buildup in Argentinian politics in the 1970s. Here you can see some more tributes to Juan Perón in the center with the graffiti and stuff like that, as well as the fact that there still is, General Juan de Perón Street in Buenos Aires and stuff along those lines. I always think it's interesting to see how a country supports or doesn't a leader after he's gone, and so it's interesting to see it still there. On the other hand, on the right, you start to see, and this is before the beginning of the issues and stuff along those lines, or the beginning of the Dirty War. Sorry, not the issues. The issue's been going on since 1916, as we talked about. But the beginning of the Dirty War, you begin to see people being like, kidnapped in the middle of the night and taken and arrested by the state, etc., etc. Okay, so we talked about how Perón was out of power here. Um, and there are a number. I said, there's six total coups in Argentina in the 20th century, and there are two more to get to the fifth coup, which takes power in 1966 after like the various like fightings and infightings and stuff like that after Perón that we just talked about. Okay, and they schedule they agree to hold elections. Okay, and basically, so they take power in '66, and what they say is by 1973 we'll hold elections. They're getting more and more unpopular, and so finally they're like, you know what? In order to not have like a whole thing, we'll hold elections. Okay. And what they say is they allow for a Peronist to run, okay, but they're not going to allow Juan Perón himself to run. So, like, this is supposed to be a quote-unquote compromise from the ruling classes and the lower Argentinians. Someone who agrees with Juan Perón can run, but not Perón himself. That Peronist wins the presidency, and then he immediately appoints Juan Perón to his cabinet, and then he resigns, and then he calls for Juan Perón to be president. And then he gets rid of that law that says Juan Perón can't run, calls for new elections, and Juan Perón is allowed to run from exile. Perón wins with 62% of the vote, which is still absolutely massively high. And he appoints his now third wife, a woman by the name of Isabel Perón, to power. To the vice presidency. Okay, and this is going to be kind of the problem to begin with, because people are like, okay, look, like, so appreciated, but like she doesn't have a history of in politics here, and it seems like you're doing this solely to create yourself as kind of a kingmaker or so, or something like that. Perón then dies less than a year after being elected, leaving Isabel Perón in power. Okay, and her government is marred by a number of different issues, which deal with corruption, ineptitude, not really knowing how to run, but also a number of different people who are literally flat out sexist towards her, like she's a woman and so therefore she shouldn't be in charge and blah blah blah. At 1 a.m. on March 27th, 1976, a junta. Now, if you don't know this, a junta is a group of military leaders. So what they say is, and it's pronounced junta, not junta, despite the fact that my favorite band's first album was named Junta and pronounced that way solely to mess with people's heads. But a junta is comprised of leaders of each branch, okay? And they come together to basically try to form a government, is the idea here. They arrest Isabel Perón. She's eventually allowed to go into exile, and they seize power. This is the last coup. This is the sixth coup, as I said. And let's note, by the way, that the United States was well aware of this coup, but they saw Peronists as populist and therefore possibly sympathetic to communism, whereas the church and the military were decidedly not sympathetic to communism, and so therefore, and this is the issue with Operation Condor and stuff like that, they supported that despite the fact that a democratically elected government was being ousted here. Okay, this is one of a number of coups that is going to occur in the cone of South America as part of Operation Condor. Okay, Argentina's, as we said, was uniquely violent compared to other countries. The only other country, and to be honest, they're kind of tied at the hip anyway, so it does not surprise me. The only other country that was equally as violent was Uruguay, where, if you can imagine this, approximately 1 in 50 people, so 2% of the population, was arrested at some time during the course of this. The people who came to charge here made it very clear that they wanted to, quote, save Western civilization, and they thought that the only way to prevent World War III was for Argentina to use a combination of conservatism, Catholicism, and militarism to restore it to its values, to restore it to its importance, and to make sure that Argentina itself was able to combat communism in the cone of South America, and that's why I said to prevent World War III. The thinking behind this with these people over and over again is that, like, that's what needs in order to happen. They continue Isabel Perón's policy of corruption and political repression, but instead they limit it to to mainly liberal groups, okay, lead to the disappearances of tens of thousands of people, many of which have never been found or are still missing today. They're going to use coded rhetoric. We'll take a look at that, and all sorts of language in order to make this thing work and to be sanctioned by the Catholic Church. And to start with that rhetoric, they're going to name this form of disappearances and stuff like that as the National Reorganization Process, or the process. Okay, originally, the first junta is going to be led by these three people right here. Okay, the guy on the left is Emilio Massera, the guy on the right is Jorge Rafael Vidala, and the guy on the sorry, I said that wrong. The guy on the left is Massera, the guy in the middle is Vidala, and the guy on the right is Orlando Agosti. Okay, Massera on the left was basically in control of propaganda. He's generally considered to be the voice of the process. Vidala, who is the general of the army, was president of the junta from 76 to 81. He's the one that, if you watch the video you're supposed to watch on Friday, the one that talked about, that was in trial and on jail for stuff like that. Agosti had the smartest role. To be honest, though, and we should be aware of this to kind of set the scene for what we're going to study after this, when this junta occurred, it was met with massive popularity. Jorge Luis Borges, the author who you read earlier, the one who had that story about the library where everything in it, etc., he was an Argentinian intellectual at this time, and his comment was, "Now we can finally be ruled by gentlemen," and a number of Argentinians felt the same way. They didn't realize what was going to happen once power was actually taken. And that is another story for a little bit later. We will take a look at the process over the course of the next day or so, and then I will take you through kind of a virtual tour of the ESMO where I show you what happened during the course of this, how people were disappeared, babies snatched, etc., etc. After a kind of weird, tough discussion like this, I hate to say, like, have a good one, everybody. So what I'll say is, like, hopefully you found this somewhat interesting and you'll keep, like, learning and understanding about this. And I will talk to you guys soon when I show you pictures of the ESMO.